Wyoming Territory, June 1880. The sun baked the dirt streets of Red Bluff as a crowd gathered near the livery stable, dust swirling around boots and skirts. The auctioneer's voice cracked over the dry wind, but it was not a horse or wagon on the block this time. It was a woman, pale, trembling, holding a swaddled baby tight to her chest. "She comes with the child," the auctioneer barked, voice laced with disgust. "One saddle gets you the both." No one laughed. Near the edge of the crowd stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a worn brown coat. His name was Merritt Elwood, and he had ridden 2 days into town to trade for feed and nails. Instead, he found himself frozen, jaw clenched, staring at the woman being sold like livestock. She kept her chin up, though her eyes flicked with panic. Strands of dark hair clung to her cheeks, and her dress was ripped along one sleeve. The baby did not cry, just blinked up at the sky, tucked close in a faded blue blanket. "Name's Naomi Whitlow," the auctioneer added like it mattered. "Husband's dead, debts unpaid. Sheriff says she's property now." A man in a dirty hat stepped forward, tossing a rough-cut saddle onto the ground. "I'll take her." "No," Merritt said, voice low but firm. He stepped forward, pulling off his hat. His boots thudded heavy as he came to stand between the man and the girl. The crowd hushed. Merritt reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. It had belonged to his mother, had sat in a box for 10 years, waiting for someone to deserve it. "I'll give her a wedding ring instead." Naomi's breath caught. She looked up at him, unsure if she was dreaming or going mad. The man with the saddle spat. "You marrying her?" "I am," Merritt said. "Right now." The sheriff scratched his beard. "You got a preacher's word?" "No. But I got land, I got a cabin, and I got no use for cruelty like this." He turned to Naomi, met her eyes. "Ma'am, it's your choice. You do not owe me anything, but I will not let them take you." Naomi stared at him, then down at her baby. Her legs wobbled. "What's your name?" she whispered. "Merritt Elwood." Her arms tightened around the child. "I have nothing, just him." "That's enough." She nodded, and just like that it was done. The sheriff grunted. "Well, hell, I reckon I seen worse weddings. You two best be gone before someone changes their mind." Merritt helped her down from the block, steadying her at the elbow. She shook, but did not fall. The baby pressed its cheek into her chest, quiet and warm. They left Red Bluff before sundown, with only the clothes on their backs and the promise of something better. The ride to Merritt's ranch was long and quiet. Naomi sat sideways on his horse, holding her boy while Merritt walked beside them, leading the reins. "His name is Elias," Naomi said softly, glancing down at the baby. "He is 1 year old," Merritt nodded. "He looks strong like his mother." She said nothing to that. They reached the ranch late the next day. A square cabin stood against the foothills, with a windmill creaking slow in the breeze and a row of cottonwoods along the stream. It was quiet, save for the horses in the corral and the rustle of prairie grass. Merritt helped her down and opened the cabin door. Inside was clean but sparse wood stove, table, one bed, a trunk, and shelves lined with jars. "You can take the bed," he said. "I will sleep in the barn." Naomi's hand hovered over the back of a chair. "You married me. You should not have to sleep in the barn." "You did not have a choice in any of this," Merritt said gently. "So now you get one." She looked away, throat tight. "You are kind." "I do not know why. I was raised better than to let a woman be sold like a mule." That night, Naomi fed Elias by the hearth while Merritt laid out blankets in the hayloft. She listened to the wind moan against the windows and wondered what sort of man did something like this without asking for anything in return. Days passed. Naomi learned the rhythm of the ranch, feeding chickens, boiling water, hanging clothes on the line. Merritt worked from before dawn until dusk fixing fence lines, tending cattle, scraping rust off tools. He never asked questions, never touched her. But every time he passed her on the porch or handed her a bucket from the well, his eyes held something steady, something soft. Elias took to him fast. He would crawl to the door when he heard Merritt's boots, lifting his arms and squealing. Merritt would scoop him up with a quiet laugh, bouncing him once before setting him on his shoulders while he worked. One evening, Naomi stood in the doorway and watched them fixing a loose hinge on the barn. Elias babbled as Merritt talked to him about nails and hinges and how horses hated storms. Naomi pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the ache there. A week after they arrived, Merritt found her crying behind the barn. She had tried to hide it, but the sobs came fast and hard, and she could not stop them. He approached slow. "Naomi," she wiped her face. "I am sorry. It all caught up to me. You do not need to apologize. I was not supposed to live like this. I was married before. My husband, he drank. We owed money. He died in the fire. The landlord said Elias and I were worth less than a saddle." Merritt sat beside her on the grass. "You are worth more than any man could measure." She looked at him, tears shining. "Why are you like this?" He shrugged. "Because people weren't like this with me." Naomi reached out, almost without meaning to, and touched his hand. "You saved us." He turned his palm up, lacing their fingers. "I want to give you more than safety," he said, "but I will wait as long as you need." She leaned into his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, she let someone hold her. And that night, under a sky lit with stars, Naomi Whitlow began to fall in love. The wind came down from the Medicine Bow Range in sharp bursts that tugged at the clothes on the line and rattled the tin pail left by the porch. Naomi stood in the garden with her sleeves rolled up, her hands sunk deep in moist earth. Her knees pressed into the soil as she thinned the beets Merritt had planted the previous spring. Elias sat in a wooden crate nearby, chewing on a corn cob and watching a grasshopper crawl along the edge. She had not worked a garden since she was a girl in Missouri, back before the war left her family scattered. Her fingers remembered the shape of roots and the feel of weeds snapping loose. The quiet was deep here, not like the silence of town, weighted and wary. This was a living hush full of birdsong and the creak of trees. She found herself breathing slower without realizing. Merritt's voice carried from the barn. "You reckon that boy of yours would like a lamb to chase?" Naomi glanced up, shielding her eyes. "You have a lamb." He came out from the barn holding a small white bundle with spindly legs and a black nose. "Found her tangled in wire last week. Orphaned. She's taken to cow's milk but still follows me like I'm her kin." He set the lamb down and it trotted straight to Elias, who clapped and squealed. "He's never touched anything so soft," Naomi said, wiping her hands on her apron. Merritt leaned on the fence rail. "He's got a good laugh. Sounds like spring water." She pulled her braid over one shoulder, twisting it tight. "I used to think he'd never hear anything gentle, not after what we came from." "You both hear it now," Merritt said. That evening, Naomi stirred a pot of beans over the fire while Merritt sought a plank for the henhouse. The smell of pine pitch drifted in as he stepped inside, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sawdust clinging to his arms. "You ever used a rifle?" he asked. She shook her head. "My father hunted squirrels when I was small. That's all I ever saw. I'd like to show you, not for sport, just so you feel safer if I'm out riding." Naomi nodded slowly. "I'd like that." They stood outside the next morning just after first light. He handed her a Winchester, showed her how to rest it against her shoulder, how to breathe just before squeezing the trigger. She steadied herself, aimed at the tin can he'd set on a fence post. The report cracked through the air and the can flew backward into the dust. She blinked. I didn't think I'd hit it. You've got a steady hand, he said, impressed. She turned toward him, her face flushed with pride. Thank you for trusting me with it. I trust you with more than that, he said, voice quiet. They didn't speak again until they'd walked back to the cabin, Elias asleep in her arms. She laid the boy in his cradle and turned to find Merritt still standing near the hearth, hat in his hands. I built this place for someone who'd never come, he said, looking at the floor. Thought I'd carry on alone, didn't expect a woman and child to fit here so easy. Naomi stepped closer, her voice low. I never expected to feel safe again, or wanted. He looked up, slow and serious. You are both. Her hand found his, rough and warm, against her palm. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have to, because I want to. He brought her hand to his chest, and for a long moment they just stood there, the fire casting soft light across their faces. Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, something steadier was taking root. Merritt came in from the east field with a limp in his step and blood soaking through the leg of his trousers. Naomi saw him from the kitchen window and was already out the door. Elias balanced on one hip before he cleared the gate. What happened? She asked, her voice tight. Barbed wire caught me wrong, he said, setting down the half-full feed sack he'd been carrying. Stepped in a burrow, lost my footing, just a tear. Sit, she said, nodding toward the porch bench. You're leaving a trail. He didn't argue. She handed Elias a crust of bread and set him in the shade beside the wash basin, then brought out a pail and clean cloth. When she knelt to roll up the trouser leg, Merritt flinched but stayed silent. The cut was deep and ragged, already turning the denim stiff with blood. This needs stitching, she said, pouring cool water over it. It'll fester by morning if you leave it. I was hoping you'd say that, he muttered. You were. She met his eyes. I trust your hands, he said simply. She worked in silence, threading the needle from the mending tin and cleaning the wound with carbolic. Merritt kept his jaw clenched, gaze fixed on the cottonwood leaves overhead. When she tied off the last stitch, he let out a breath he'd been holding. Thank you, he said, voice rough. You'd have done the same, she said, standing to gather the cloths. Maybe, but I wouldn't have done it near as steady. That night, Naomi boiled potatoes and fried the last of the salt pork. Elias fell asleep with his cheek against her knee, and Merritt stayed at the table, leg propped on a chair, watching the firelight flicker up the wall. I've been thinking, he said, about the land north of the creek. She looked up from her mending. What about it? It's too rocky for cattle. But if we cleared it, fenced it off, we could plant winter wheat. He leaned back, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. It wouldn't be much at first, but it's steady food, and you've got a good sense for planting. You want us to stay through winter, she said. He didn't answer right away. I built this place to be lived in, he said finally. Not just used up and abandoned. I'd like to see a second season pass with you here. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. I've thought about it too, what it would mean, to stop waiting for the ground to fall out from under us. He nodded. You wouldn't be waiting anymore. Not here. Later, after Elias was tucked between quilts in the corner, Naomi stepped out onto the porch where Merritt sat sharpening a draw knife. I remember something, she said, folding her arms, from when I was little. My mother used to hum while she peeled apples, even when there was barely enough flour for a crust. Merritt paused, lowering the blade. She said as long as there's a roof and something warm in the pot, you can find peace. Even if it's just for a little while, he looked at her, eyes steady in the dim light. You've got both now, he said, and no one's coming to take them. She moved closer, resting her hand on the porch rail beside his. I don't want peace just for a little while, she said. I want something that lasts. I want to build it with you. Merritt stood, slow with his injured leg, and reached for her hand. Then we'll build it, he said. one quiet day at a time. And when he kissed her, it was without hesitation, the kind that came from knowing, not hoping, that this, at last, was home. By the third week of August, the cottonwoods had begun to drop their first yellow leaves, and the air carried that restless scent of the season turning. Naomi had taken to mending in the evenings, her needle stitching slow and even by the firelight. Merritt had built a small cradle for Elias using leftover pine boards, sanded smooth at the edges where the boy's tiny fingers liked to grip. One morning, Merritt returned from the trading post with a bundle wrapped in calico cloth and a slip of folded paper tucked beneath his coat. Naomi met him at the gate, brushing flour from her hands. "I didn't expect you back till sundown," she said, taking note of the strain in his jaw. "I rode fast," he said, handing her the bundle. "Saw something I thought you'd want." Inside the cloth lay a worn slate and a bit of chalk. Naomi's hands lingered over it. "I used to teach," she said, almost to herself, "before I married, before everything turned. I figured you'd know how to use it better than I would," he said. "There's more in the note." She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was spidery but clear. A man from Cheyenne had written to say the Territorial Council was hoping to open a schoolhouse 2 counties east come spring. They needed volunteers, women who could read, who knew arithmetic, who could recite scripture with clarity and keep order among children who had never seen a desk. Naomi read it twice, then lowered the paper to her lap. "I thought I'd set that part of me down," she said. "You don't have to pick it up again," Merritt said. "But if you wanted to, I'd ride with you. Help build the walls." She looked at him with something unreadable in her eyes, then turned toward the porch where Elias sat in the shade, dragging a stick through the dust. "Would you mind if I taught him letters?" she asked. "I'd be proud," he said. The days shortened. Naomi began waking before light to warm milk for Elias and grind cornmeal for Johnny cakes. Merritt rode the fence lines less often now, working closer to the house, patching the sod roof where it had begun to settle in the middle. At night, he read from the old Bible his mother had left behind, his voice low and careful, each word chosen like a stone laid into foundation. One afternoon, Naomi returned from collecting wild rosehips near the ravine with Elias bundled against her back, and her boots thick with mud. She found Merritt in the barn, seated on a stool with a shoebox open beside him. Inside were folded letters he'd never sent, names she'd never heard, and a dried flower pressed between the pages of an old hymnal. "I don't want to keep anything from you," he said, not looking up. She eased down beside him, unwrapping the cloth from Elias, who stirred but did not wake. "Is it someone you loved?" she asked. "It was someone I thought I could," he said. "Years ago, she married someone else. I left Missouri not long after." Naomi touched the edge of the hymnal, her fingers still damp from the riverbank. "I don't need to read them," she said. "I want you to," he said. "So you know what's behind me, so nothing's hidden when we go forward." She didn't open the letters, not then. She gathered them gently, tied them back with the twine, and placed the box on the shelf beside the oil lamp. "Whatever's written in them," she said, "I know the man who walked away from it." Merritt stood, not quickly but with purpose. He reached for her hand. "I never thought I'd be seen like this." "You are," she said, "and I want all of it. The quiet, the hard, the things that don't have names." Outside, dusk settled like a blanket over the land. Crickets began their song. In the cradle, Elias turned once, then stilled. And in that barn, with the scent of hay and old sorrow surrounding them, 2 people who had been broken in different ways chose, without hesitation, to begin again. The first frost came overnight, crisping the edges of the last squash leaves and turning the morning light to silver. Naomi stood barefoot on the cabin floor, warming her toes by the stove while Elias snored softly in his cot. She had placed a kettle of coffee over the coals just before dawn, and the scent filled the room. Merritt stepped in from the lean-to, his coat dusted with frost, carrying 2 bundles of chopped wood. He set them down quietly and pulled off his gloves, flexing his fingers. "Creek's icing over at the edges," he said. "Won't be long before we're snowed in." Naomi poured a cup and handed it to him, her eyes searching his face. "You worried about supplies?" He shook his head. "We've got enough flour and beans to make it through March. I bartered for smoked venison last week." "We'll be all right." He took a sip, then added, "I was thinking more about the roof. If the weight gets heavy, I may need to brace the north side." "I can help with that," she said. He lowered the cup. "You've done more than enough." "I just don't want you out in the cold." "Then don't leave me inside wondering," she said. "I'd rather be cold beside you than warm alone." He gave a small nod, brow furrowed like he was weighing something. "I've been meaning to ask you something, but I didn't want to until I was sure you'd answer for your own sake, not mine." Naomi set down her cup, waiting. "I hadn't thought about a preacher before. I figured what we did that day in Red Bluff was binding enough. But if it would mean something to you to make it known proper, I can ride to the mission near Rawlins. Bring one here." She tilted her head. "You thought you'd ask me to marry you again." "I'm not asking again," he said. "I'm offering the choice. You were cornered the first time. This time I want it to be yours alone." Naomi crossed the room, slow and certain, until she stood in front of him. She reached up and brushed her fingers along the line of his jaw, where his stubble caught the morning light. "I've been yours every day since that town," she said. "But if you're asking me to stand before God and speak it aloud, I will. Not because I need proof, because I want to say it with joy in my chest." They were married a week later, in the cotton clearing near the stream, beneath a sky so blue it seemed painted. The preacher wore a coat patched at the elbow, his voice gravelly with age, but his hands were steady as he folded them over theirs. Elias clutched a pine cone and toddled between their feet while the wind lifted Naomi's braid from her shoulder. "I give myself freely," Merritt said, eyes never leaving hers. "And I receive you freely," Naomi answered, her voice clear. Afterward, they shared bread and boiled apples with the preacher and his wife, who had ridden with him and brought a quilt as a gift. They stayed the night, sleeping in the barn, and rode out before first light, leaving behind a blessing and a trail of hoofprints in the frost. That winter was long, but it did not feel hard. Naomi taught Elias to string beans and count stones into piles. Merritt carved a second rocking chair and sanded it smooth, placing it beside hers at the hearth. They spent the evenings reading aloud from the Bible and the almanac, sometimes saying nothing at all, just resting in the quiet that no longer felt like absence. In February, Naomi found the first pages of a primer tucked beneath her sewing basket. Merritt had shaped each letter by hand, carving them into thin pine boards. She ran her fingers over the grooves, her throat tightening. "I want him to learn from you first," Merritt said when he caught her looking. "But I figured I could help him see the shapes." In the spring, they planted barley in the cleared field, the soil dark and rich from the compost Merritt had saved all winter. Naomi scattered wildflower seeds along the edge, and Elias helped press them into the ground with his tiny palm. They built a smokehouse beside the barn. Merritt showed Naomi how to twist rope from horsehair, and she taught him how to make soap from the leftover ash and fat. Elias grew taller, his curls darkening, his voice always chasing after their footsteps. In the fall, Naomi received a letter from the school council. The schoolhouse had been built. They offered her a post for the following year, with housing provided for the teacher's family. "I told them I'd come," she said as they sat beneath the cottonwoods, Elias asleep in her lap. but only if the man I married would be willing to haul lumber for desks and teach the boys to cut kindling. Merritt smiled, gaze turned toward the hills. I'd do that. I'd even sit in the back and learn to write my name proper if you wanted. She leaned against his shoulder. You already gave me your name. That was more than enough. They moved the next summer, taking only what they could load into the wagon. The cabin stayed standing, door latched, windows shuttered. Merritt returned each season to check the land, tend the field, mend the fence where the elk passed through. In the new town, Naomi taught 20 children to read, and Merritt built the benches they sat on. Elias grew up knowing both the weight of an axe and the feel of a book in his hands. Their home was filled with what they built together: shelves lined with jars, walls papered in maps, a porch wide enough for 2 chairs, and a basket of worn toys. And every night, as the sky darkened and the wind settled, Merritt would rest his hand on Naomi's back, and she would lean into him, and they would breathe in the quiet they had earned. They never left each other's side again, not for a season, not for a year, not for a heartbeat. Their life was not grand, but it was good, and it was theirs.